Hello, target audience. Local script man here. If you don't know me, I've been making storytelling-related content on YouTube for almost 3 years now, if you can believe it. I've covered a broad range of topics on this channel: plot structure, character psychology, overall storytelling theory, hot takes, cold takes, and it has been fun, but I am the kind of person who needs an overarching goal just to keep my head on straight. And so I had a crazy idea. What if I took everything I ever talked about and I just packed it into one video, like a Bible for all of my ideas? Of course, my ideas is a generous way of putting it. A lot of the things I say on my channel are just me reconfiguring things that other people said. So anyways, I spent long nights in dubiously reviewed Paneras writing this absolute Frankenstein of a video. And I rented some equipment and I shot myself in front of a green screen, and that was way back in August of 2024. You see, life happened, as it does, and I ended up sitting on the footage for months, and when I finally started cutting it together, I realized that my understanding of stories had changed quite a bit in those months. At first, I was tempted to rewrite and reshoot the entire video to convey that, but I also know that the language and logic I've traditionally used on my channel really helps a portion of the writing community. So if I diluted that language with all of the new language I've since adopted, it might not serve as the effective tool I know it can. Plus, I'm a lazy bones and I'm in complete denial of the sunk costs fallacy. The goal of this video is to convey one specific process. Not the ultimate process, not the only process I use, just a process. It might be the tool your brain needs right now, it might not. If you're not sure, there are two main groups who seem to really gravitate towards my content. If you identify with one or both, I might be your type. The first group is aspiring writers and directors who want to tell cool stories with complex themes. Think Nolan, think Denis Villeneuve. But they feel like their own work doesn't touch the same cerebral depths that it should be touching, or the emotional catharsis moments just aren't clicking, and so they need to figure out how to arrange their elements to get that deep, meaty stuff. The second group are the daydreamers, the awkward, spaced-out kids who were obsessed with their characters and storylines growing up, but never managed to capitalize on those creative instincts. And these people just want to get the thing out of their heads and onto the page. I am a blend of these two categories. I empathize with both. In some respects, I think the point of my content has been to bridge the gap between these two immature hemispheres of creativity, the overly logical mindset and the overly intuitive mindset. If I can give the logical types a road to emotion and subjectivity, the intuitives can take that same road back to order and structure. Do I think I've fully accomplished this yet? No, of course not. There are so many writers out there trying to improve their stories. One thing is not going to be the thing everybody needs. Growth looks different for different people. But I think this method has helped enough people that it deserves to exist in official canonized form, no matter how non sequitur and scatterbrained that proves itself to be. So, without further ado, here's that. Stories come in infinite styles and flavors across a broad spectrum of media that I'm not even remotely qualified to talk about. That's why the focus here is just on outlining the nuts and bolts of storytelling, the narrative DNA that I believe connects us all, regardless of how different our projects may seem. My goal in this video is to help you build the most comprehensive outline possible, so that when you're standing on the edge of the cliff, looking out at that daunting first draft, it isn't so daunting because you already did all of the grunt work, and now you can just let your artistic powers loose without having to worry about writer's block. This is my methodology, but I will at times translate other methodologies into local scriptees to show how my method accounts for them. Also, a major mechanic of this class will be taking clips from my old videos and plugging them in at relevant times to hopefully put those ideas into perspective as part of a cohesive whole. All of the graphs and character sheets that I use are available for free on my website in the Resources tab. While I will be treating this like a linear timeline of creation, by all means take only what works for you and throw the rest away. My advice is to have a project in your head as you go into this video. If you don't, you won't really know what's useful to you and what isn't. Okay, so at the beginning of most people's writing journeys, they have a phase. It's where they go, well, I want to be a writer. I'm gonna have to write something. And so they sit down and they open up their computer and they stare at the blank document like they were taught to, and nothing comes, nothing feels right. It's very frustrating. And all of the internet exclaims in unison, just start writing. If you want to be a writer, just start writing. It doesn't matter if it's bad, just start writing. But you can't because that's not how your brain works, and you just want to hurl yourself into an industrial meat grinder. When I was a wee lad, first getting interested in storytelling, there was so much pressure surrounding this first step because I expected nothing less than a watershed moment to tell me which idea was the one. I was paralyzed by possibility and unsure of where to plant my roots. I believe this phenomenon can be explained, as all things can, with a fun little diagram. Imagine that this is the process of writing a script from beginning to end. The first leg of the trail is all about preference, deciding on your premise, deciding who your characters are. In this stage, there are no right or wrong answers. It comes down to novelty and personal taste. Eventually, though, preference gives way to problem solving. You created all of your dots, and now it's time to connect them. In this stage, something either works or doesn't. You start rearranging your ideas and finding logical ways to tie them together. But in the last section of the journey, you return to preference mode. You have a finished outline, it's super cohesive, but you find yourself hung up on the right way to word a line or the funniest joke to use in a given scene. The same anxiety of possibility can take over here because you're no longer solving problems and you're once again deferring to your creative inner voice. I live in this middle section. Virtually all of my consulting work and all of my videos happen here. You come to me at this stage, this first stage here, you ask me, how do I have a good idea? What should my story be about? I got no answer. That's on you. Unfortunately, not knowing what you want is not a problem someone else can fix. You have to decide what you want. It could be that none of your ideas are sparking joy in your heart. This is normal. Ideas are cheap. It's very hard to care about something that doesn't exist yet. A lot of people, myself included, don't even get invested in the story until the problem-solving phase. So you might just need to plow forward until you get to there. This is where it gets fun in my experience. But to get there, we just have to dive in and start making creative decisions. The original vision for this video was to create an original story from front to back using my method in real time. And that was going to be the centerpiece of the whole project. I was in love with this idea. I was so in love with it that I couldn't accept it wasn't working. The more specific I got with my demo story, the harder it became to make the points I set out to make. Maybe it was just a skill issue, entirely possible, but I was unable to make a video that was both an end-all, be-all Bible for my channel and a satisfying account of one particular creative endeavor without it feeling like the video had multiple personalities. Ultimately, I chose the former because that was the point. If you do want to see my creation process from the POV of the writer, watch this video. I think it perfectly captures the duality of creative vision and structured thinking. It doesn't show off all of my tools, but it does show a handful of them in action. The video you're watching, by contrast, will be a fully stocked Home Depot that you can revisit to find the exact tool that you need. But I don't want to throw out the demo story just yet. A long time ago, back when I was fully committed to making this just another story documentary, I made a community post asking people to submit and vote on what the premise of my story should be. And the winning answer was a story about a nomadic beekeeper trying to repollinate a post-climate apocalypse wasteland. Despite the priorities of this video, Beekeeper still has a role to play. I'm going to use that storyline in one particular segment of the video, the segment that starts now. So that's my starting point. I've chosen a premise, but even after choosing my premise, I'm still in preference mode. The sentence doesn't really give me any indication as to who my characters are or what my plot is. 100 writers could take this and write 100 different stories from it. So where do I start? My answer to that used to be theme. Take a theme, any theme. What are all the potential perspectives one could have on that theme? Oh, well, there's this one and this one and this one and this one and this. Take each perspective and turn it into a character. Boom, cast. Whether you found it helpful or not, and I know a lot of people did, my themes dogma was all over the place. Sometimes I would say a theme was a question and that the different characters should have different answers to that question. Sometimes I would say the theme was the subject matter and that the characters should have different opinions on the subject matter. Sometimes I would just interpret it as exploring different roles in a conflict. And I got away with this because nobody else knows what a theme is either. It's one of those words that doesn't have a clear meaning, so you can kind of just use it however you want. Like for a lot of people, theme means the moral message you impose on your audience. I have never once used it like that. So if you ever heard me say theme and thought I was using the John Truby definition, oops, communication error. Some people use theme as like, oh, that's a recurring theme in the story. So then a theme is like a pattern. It's just kind of a gross, mucky word to me at this point. And I've been phasing it out of my vocabulary in the last several videos because I don't like how unclear it is. And honestly, I don't think we need it. If you want to talk about the emotional logic of your story that allows the good guy to win the gunfight, just say that. If you want to talk about your message to the audience, just say that. If you want to talk about the ideas that the characters grapple with, just say that. We don't need this fake deep catch-all word to tell the stories you want to tell. I've read 110-page drafts where I'll get to the end of it and I'll have oodles of notes, and not once did my brain go, something's missing. Oh, I know the theme. I think we'd be better off just letting the consumers have that word. It's not an actual building block in the way I used to think it was. I'm going to talk about differentiating characters later. I haven't thrown those tactics out. If anything, I've sharpened them and made them more specific. But I can't get into that until I actually explain what a character is. So what is a character? Well, I used to say characters aren't people because it sounds smart and profound. And it's true technically because people are real and characters are fake. But a lot of folks will hear characters aren't people and take it to mean my knowledge about humans need not apply to my fake humans. And that's not true. A character is still a simulated person. So when characters start acting in a manner that's super inconsistent with human behavior, we tend to go, okay, that's weird. I don't know if I buy that. Notwithstanding some level of artistic liberty, human is clearly the bar. I think what characters aren't people really means is that characters are more focused depictions of people. So a story about Bob might just be about his relationship issues. Of course, Bob's life is bigger than his relationship issues. Relationship issues are simply what the story is about. But what is shown still gets measured against reality. So instead of thinking of people and characters as apples and oranges, think of them as apples and slices of apples. My premise tells me a little something about my character, so let's take a look at that. A story about a nomadic beekeeper trying to repollinate a post-climate apocalypse wasteland. I'm really glad this premise is worded the way it is because it gives me an opportunity to make some important points. This character is saving the climate. She's doing something that most people would consider to be very good. But good and evil are external labels. They exist outside of the individual. This is true whether you believe they're socially constructed or that they're objective metaphysical rules. Either way, they are external standards that we can measure things against. So we can't look at a human and say that they're motivated by good or that they're motivated by evil. What's actually going on then? Well, on my channel, I conceptualize people with this. This is the character map. It basically creates a hierarchy of depth in a character so that you can figure out exactly how well you know them. A character experiences circumstances and learns to deal with those circumstances in a certain way, which they subconsciously apply to all areas of their life. At a glance, it looks like we have a clearly defined character with a clearly defined motivation. Her goal is to fix the climate, except goals go here. So really, we don't know anything about this character except one vestigial detail, what she wants. We're going to have to work backwards to figure out who she really is and what she's all about. Remember, we're still in preference mode, so there are going to be multiple ways to do things, all of them valid. Maybe our beekeeper has an achiever complex and wants to be the hero who saved the world, and her journey is about letting go of that and learning to serve in silence. Maybe she sees nature as an escape, and her journey will involve confronting the real problems she's been ignoring. Maybe she's obsessed with nature's perfection and wants to use it to correct the world, and her journey will see her accepting imperfection in the world, in those around her, and in herself. The key here isn't which one you pick. They're all viable-ass stories. The key is to pick one and not delude yourself into thinking they're all the same story. Those are 3 different characters with 3 different psychological complexes. 3 completely different ways to arrive at this. For my story, I think I want the character to have a helper complex. For a character who serves others and the world, I like the idea of that service coming from a place of personal satisfaction. At some point in the theoretical distant past, this character wasn't getting her emotional needs met except when she was helpful to others, so she learned to people please. And in the context of her occupation, that looked like helping communities in the wasteland. I know my sheet has a big thing for backstory, but it's not that I actually care about backstory. This was just my way of hammering in the idea that the forces in your brain that drive you to act in a certain way are adaptive. They are behaviors that you adopted because they helped you get your needs met or survive, and they became subconscious patterns over time. If a character has an urge to distract themselves from their problems, we can assume that they learned this coping strategy at some point in their childhood, but how they learned it is probably not relevant to your story. Your character can simply is the way they be. In version 2.0, this section was called Core Belief, but this was confusing because belief to a lot of people means a conscious philosophy, like people are good or there's something wrong with me. That is not what I meant. What I was really aiming for was an I have to belief, a deep-seated compulsion. I should have just known to spell everything out in big obvious text, a lesson I learned from the Mount Olympus of communication that is Bucky's. So, in version 2.1, I have changed this to core urge. I think the word urge successfully communicates this subconscious, visceral thing. Belief could be construed as philosophy, drive could be construed as a conscious goal, and compulsion has too many syllables, so it's the urge. You're going to hear this word a lot. The bedrock of a person is the way in which they learned to get their needs met in order to manage life, which becomes an all-consuming subconscious urge. The urge is general, that's the whole point of it. It's a generalized compulsion that affects all areas of life. So an urge wouldn't be, I have to please mom, it would be, I have to please everybody, even if it originally just came from mom. The young human pattern-matching brain decides, that's how I handled this, so that's how I'm going to handle everything. In the case of a child character, this is often the content of the story itself, whereas adult stories typically involve the characters taking off their emotional armor, i.e. confronting or unlearning their urge. Child-centric stories typically explore how they got that in the first place. At the beginning of the story, these child characters might have some personality to them, and they almost certainly have basic universal drives, eating, sleeping, having fun, loving their families, but on the urge level, they begin the story as blank slates. Take Taika Waititi's 2010 film Boy. The protagonist is a child character who looks to his father for guidance and approval. Relying on a parent is not a learned behavior, it's innate and necessary. Boy realizes that his father is an irresponsible, childish grifter who doesn't have the answers and is unequipped to nurture him.
Can you stop calling me Dad? Sounds weird.
Thus, Boy develops an urge to become emotionally independent. By the end of the story, his heart is hardened. He has become his own man, for better or for worse. He will not let his emotional dependency on his father or anyone else hurt him again. One can imagine a sequel to Boy, where the protagonist realizes that he has closed himself off to emotional connection and struggles to unlearn this maladaptive urge. Now, even though a kid is functionally a blank slate, we can still cheat. We can prime the child character for the greatest possible whiplash by custom building their baseline personality for the greatest possible whiplash. The story of Boy wouldn't be as impactful if the character was already a tough, stubborn kid. If you want your kid to develop the urge to reject connection, you make his natural baseline soft and needy. That way the spring is pulled all the way back, and you've set the stage for the greatest possible change. But really, I don't want to oversimplify it. Just think of your coming-of-age story as backstory. Imagine the character as an adult with adult urges. How did they get this way? That's your story. Down here is the manifestation level. The urge can lead to goals, it can affect relationships, and basically every other way that you show up in the world. Some people fill this out and send it to me, but they just write their character trivia in these boxes, and that's not how that's supposed to work. The point of this is to show how all of these things flow from the urge. For an unhealthy person, the urge has the wheel. It's the most important thing about them. It guides the broad strokes of their life. But how does this factor into storytelling? Is the urge a positive character trait? Is it negative? In fact, it's whatever you want it to be. Since the urge is internal and morality is external and context is external, it stands to reason that the urge is neither good or evil. It's neutral. It's not inherently a flaw or a virtue. It's just an urge. But in your story, you can choose to frame it as a flaw or a virtue. In The Matrix, Neo is driven towards the truth. He prioritizes understanding over his personal pleasure and comfort. This is an urge framed as a virtue. Because he is compelled to know the truth, he takes the leap of faith and the story rewards him for it. Urge as virtue is the basis for the hero archetype. It's still necessarily adaptive like everything else, but the character is never punished for it. In a different context, though, that same urge can be framed as a flaw. This is the preferred option in most stories. Rust Cole from True Detective shares the same urge as Neo. He needs to make sense of the world. But in the context of that story, Rust's urge holds him back. And thus, we set the stage for an arc. What is an arc? Well, when some people say arc, they mean like one leg of the story. Like if the characters are all at the haunted mall for a few episodes, that's the haunted mall arc. That's not how I'm using the term. When I say arc, I mean the complete emotional or psychological change that the character undergoes over the course of the entire story. Now, do you have to have an arc? No, that's always a dumb question. You don't have to do anything, but I want my character to have one. Arcs address urges. Arcs don't happen down here in the manifestation levels. So your favorite flavor of ice cream changing from chocolate to vanilla, not an arc. Getting really good at boxing, not an arc. Disliking your dad, but then eventually liking him, not an arc. Because you're describing changes on shallower levels, but not actually connecting them back to the person's psyche, back to the person's core urge. The real change needs to happen here, which trickles down to relationships and skills and preferences. Disliking your dad but then eventually liking him is not an arc in and of itself. But if we say that you're driven by an urge to dominate and control things, and your dad is a softy McSofty pants, and you don't like him because you think he's weak, but then your dominance complex is challenged and you grow and you realize it's okay to be weak, that's going to change the way you see your dad. See how I had to go up and over to make that work? That's drama. Drama connects characters to deeper urges and inner conflicts.
Melodrama, on the other hand, is just about the characters. So with drama, you get stories about people navigating their unhealthy urges and philosophies in a web of subconscious symbology. But with melodrama, it's just, I like you because you're my friend. Oh no, Uncle Tim is in the hospital. I am so sad because I love Uncle Tim. I didn't like football until I started playing football and I realized that I liked it. See what I'm doing? All this stuff is happening in the lower levels. It's not connecting back up to here. Another example, person 1 and person 2 are attracted to each other. They just have chemistry. That is melodrama. But if person 1 challenges person 2 to overcome their maladaptive patterning and vice versa, and they learn and grow from the relationship on these deeper levels, or something like that, it actually becomes drama. I don't think melodrama is bad. Most of our relationships in real life are melodramatic most of the time. It's fine, but the difference is night and day. And once you learn to see it, you'll realize why a lot of stories don't scratch your brain in the way they should.
When I was writing this, multiple people suggested that Beekeeper could be motivated to save the climate because someone she loved nature, and he died, so now she feels like she has to complete his mission. Like it or not, this trope is melodramatic. Brother, nature, but where is she in all of this? Where does it all link back up to here? It doesn't. It feels deep because it's about love and connections and symbols, but it's lacking a direct line to this character's psyche. If I went that route, she would just be the sum of all her relationships. It's melodramatic. It's not going to give you an arc. I realize that I just dissed this ubiquitous trope without offering an alternative, so here's one. This is going to sound weird, but in a story about relationships, familial or otherwise, you have to ask what the characters mean to each other. For instance, what does Beekeeper's brother mean to her in this hypothetical? And you might say, oh, well, he's her brother, so she loves her, and that would be incorrect. I mean, I'm sure she does, but for story purposes, you have to go beyond that. But how about Beekeeper sees her brother as a source of safety, so she's afraid of losing him because that would mean she would lose her safe place. You see how that connects up to an idea, up to a selfish thing in the brain? And then you can give her an arc based on that idea. It's worth mentioning that an arc doesn't have to be a complete 180. A character who starts out the story completely rejecting emotional connection, but by the end manages to form one authentic relationship, has still undergone an arc. They've put a dent in their major psychological problem. They've partially unlearned their urge. Another side note, redemption arcs. Some of the most memorable arcs in fiction involve a character going from evil to good. When you write these arcs, be careful about having your character simply discover empathy and learn, oh wait, I shouldn't be bad, I should be good. In a redemption arc, what you should be asking is, what urge has been stopping this person from being good? Even if evil could be derived from genuine ignorance as opposed to a more active process like the urge to control or the urge to cling to a support system, I don't even know if it would be reasonable to frame it as evil. It certainly isn't interesting to me. Like, they didn't know how to be a good person, but now they do. All better. There's just no meat on that bone. IMO. Now I realize that I'm operating under a very strict definition of what an arc is. So for the other kinds of change, I use the word development. Your favorite ice cream flavor changing isn't an arc, but it is development. The character being bad at fighting in season 1, but then slowly getting good over time. Not an arc, but that is development. Development is perfectly valid, but don't confuse it for real dramatic change. Development is a change in the how or the what. An arc is a change in the why. Remember this guy? Everybody will talk about how he had a big arc that spanned the entire saga, but I would challenge that hypothesis. When we meet Tony Stark for the first time in the first Iron Man movie, he's a person who distracts himself from dealing with his problems. He refuses to look the darkness in the face, pretending everything is okay, and he's just a harmless little arms dealer. Hey everyone, let's go party. Don't think about the bad. But then he's forced to confront the ugly reality of things. After his brush with death, Tony cuts out the distractions and devotes his life to helping people, even willing to sacrifice himself at the end of the movie to stop his warmongering business partner from perpetuating evil into the world. That's the first movie. Complete 180 character arc. Tony is in like 10 movies after this, and his priorities do not change. His methods certainly change. He adopts different ideologies, but it's all in the service of the man he became in the first movie and the urge he unlearned. Everything after Iron Man 1 is mostly development. In Iron Man 2, there's a bit of confronting this after the fact, making peace with his father. Avengers 2012 tries to sell us on the idea that Tony is selfish, but that mostly takes the form of other characters accusing him. Really, his priorities are solid. He's the same guy from the end of the first movie. Development, melodrama, yep, same guy. Thinks about putting his happiness first. Ooh, is he gonna do it? Nope, same guy. Sacrifices himself for real this time. The end. This is not me being a hater. I think Tony's journey is super well done. If anything, this is a testament to how much you can accomplish without an arc. But it's important when you're writing change to understand what level that change is happening at. This packing the arc into the origin story tactic is pretty much the standard with superheroes. A lot of people confuse development for arcs, so they'll try to build a story around a trait like impulsiveness, thinking that impulsiveness is some deep level flaw in and of itself. But impulsiveness goes here. It relates to skills or the lack thereof. Nobody is just impulsive. They're impulsive in the service of a deeper urge. If the story is only addressing the impulsiveness and not the deeper urge, that's not an arc. It's development. The how is changing, the why is the same. Finally, there's this box, which is called stated belief or lie. The reason this exists is that most people aren't aware of what's really driving them. You might be driven by an urge to succeed because as a child, that was the only way you received love. But if you're an average to low consciousness person, you don't know that. So when somebody asks, why do you work so hard? Your brain has to make up something. So you say, oh, well, don't you know, success makes you better. In this video, I used an example character who was depressed, and I said, as a screenwriting coach, I encounter many instances of the lonely, depressed character, like way more than you would think. It's by far the most common archetype I see in other people's writing. These characters don't know what they want. They're socially isolated. They have somewhere between 0 and 1 friend. They're usually a young person with a boring job. Their parents are typically in the picture to offer some level of encouragement, but the protagonist is just flat, no passion for life, simply existing, locked in their room all day, which is predictably described as messy. I can usually tell that I'm dealing with one of these stories because it starts with an alarm clock. And the first question I ask is, why are they like this? And the answer I get is, I don't know, they're just depressed. Yeah, but what causes this character to self-isolate and neglect their health? Depression. Yeah, but what do they want? What's their primary driving motivation? Well, they don't really have any motivation. And these conversations used to go back and forth without making any progress on these characters, because every time I tried to uncover meaning, I was told that meaninglessness was the point. But eventually, I found an angle. Instead of drilling these people about motivations and backstories, I started asking them one simple question. What does your character believe about themselves? Not everybody has deep-seated motivations or convictions, but everybody has a self-concept. And so the clients couldn't skirt around this question when I asked it. And lo and behold, when I did, the conversation would finally blossom into something actionable. We'd realize that the protagonist was not, in fact, stricken with vague, unspecific Kirkland brand depression, but with a particular self-concept issue. Maybe they believe that if they go out into the world, they'll be overwhelmed by the chaos of it all, so they stay at home and play video games. Maybe they believe that it's too late for them to make friends. Maybe they believe that the outside world hates them. Maybe they believe that they're doomed to fail at anything they try. Maybe they believe that they are a danger to others. And don't tell me it's all of those things. Pick one, decide on a core belief, and then work outward from there. A lot of people found this helpful, but have asked me how this slots into my methodology. Well, it goes somewhere between here and here. Again, this is a distortion, so it might be the case that they know exactly why they're stuck, but more than likely they've created a false story to explain it. A story that paints them as a victim of circumstance. For a depressed guy, that could mean, I'm just fundamentally worthless. It's definitely not that I learned I couldn't get ahead from a very young age, so now I don't try, or maybe he does know that. There's a gradient there. I just like using the lie because it gives the character another wall to knock down. Like, the first half could be them realizing this is untrue, and then the second half could be them grappling with the real reasons behind their behavior. If they understand their own mind right from the jump, it's going to be more challenging to create those emotional beats. Returning to Boy, this movie would, in my opinion, be so much less engaging if Alamein, the father, knew why he was the way he was, but instead Taika wraps him in this insanely entertaining personality of phony toughness and bogus life philosophy. artfully masking the soul of the character until the very end. The dissonance between the urge and the justifying lie is the root of much subtext. Don't sleep on this. This box is also where we put ideology and religion. Not ideology and religion in a world-building sense, but in an individual, what does this person believe sense. One of the biggest mistakes I see people making is assuming ideology is the deepest level of a person's psyche. It's not. If I ask you, why do you believe what you believe, you might say, oh, well, because it's true, or because it's right. And it might be true, it might not, but that's not why you feel so strongly about it, right? You feel so strongly about it because it does something for you. This is what people don't understand about indoctrination. It's not just a matter of lying. If you want to get people to sign up for your cult, your religion, your philosophy, you have to appeal to their deeper urges. Ideas don't catch on for no reason. Your idea has to do something for them. Think about it. Out of all the ideas that you encounter, how many actually resonate with you in your gut? Very few. Most ideas just bounce off. You don't latch onto them, regardless of whether they're true or whether they're right. I mean, maybe what I say on my channel about people and how they work is true, but is it really truth I'm after? I'm not making videos about the truth of electromagnetic fields or the truth of the chemical composition of Laffy Taffy or the truth of 20th century Brazilian economics. I'm interested in the specific sort of truth that serves my ends and how I navigate the world. So it's really not a matter of truth at all, it's a matter of utility. I think the same thing is often true about morals. I mean, you ever hear two morally correct statements of relative equal importance, but one really fires you up and the other one you're just like, yeah, that too? What that should tell you is that the morals themselves aren't the point. There's deeper forces working within you that dictate whether an idea sticks the landing. Your characters cannot embrace ideas for ideas' sake. Like, think of an example, something light, something unprovocative, racism. A writer who doesn't understand this principle will write a bigoted character and just say, they were raised wrong, or they were fed the wrong ideas. Whereas a writer who knows how brains work will take the time to show how such an ideology satisfies the character's urge. Sometimes two people with completely different urges will latch onto the same ideology for two completely different reasons. Maybe Blip Blop has an urge to feel above others, derived from a pressure to be the best, which manifests as putting others down. Maybe Gloop Glop feels fundamentally afraid of the world and has designated a scapegoat as part of an us versus them tribal binary to give them a sense of security and purpose. Both of them end up on Team Racist, but for completely different reasons. And if all you know is that ideology, you'll miss out on the reasons and your characters won't be as deep. If you can't ground your characters' beliefs in some sort of selfish utility, at least in their pre-arc state, that's a good sign that you haven't figured out their depths yet. Don't just say, they subscribe to this belief, or they belong to this faction. Ask, what does this belief or faction do for them? I've had some people come to me with stories about a character who starts out thinking one way, but then drifts to another ideology, but then realizes there are issues with that and drifts to a different ideology. And I know what they're trying to do is make some kind of point about what the right way to live is, but all I see is this character is searching for an ideology because they don't feel secure in themselves and are looking for an external system to cling to, and their arc will involve them unlearning the urge to do so. That's just how my brain works. I'm always going to look for the internal why of it all. I don't have an issue with thought experiments and social statements and all that. By all means, go nuts. But it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for ignoring actual human behavior. Your characters still have to behave like people. I mean, if they don't, then isn't your message being delivered under false pretenses? Wouldn't a failure to account for human patterning compromise your entire argument? There's also the idea of the fear. Many writing teachers position a character's fear as a central component of them, like a specific phobia. I always knew I didn't like this because my conception of urges is very general, but I was having trouble placing fear in all of this. It was one of the last sections I wrote. I think for me, fear is just an emotion. It's an all-purpose chemical mechanism in the brain. Fear is the grease that keeps this machine running. The character basically fears this happening again, or they indulge in their behavior because they subconsciously fear what will happen if they don't. Fear is the emotion that compels them to follow their urge. So the fear of being alone would translate to, I was alone once, it really messed me up, and now I cling to other people for support because I fear that happening again. But remember, the backstory is not necessary, so it stands to reason that it doesn't have to be specific either, which means it's perfectly okay to just start from fear, like a general fear about the universe, and then use the urge to show how the character deals with that existential thresher. The important thing is that the emotion of fear compels a person to follow their urge. Actually, let's talk about assembling a whole cast. There are a few formulas for creating supporting characters that I find helpful. If you'll remember my original Variations on a Theme model, these formulas are all more technical versions of that. All of them revolve around differentiation. The deepest form of differentiation is differentiation on this level. Characters fighting because they like different ice cream flavors, very shallow. Characters fighting because they're fundamentally compelled in completely different directions, hell yeah. If you have a group of 5 people, each would have a different core urge. They exist on different axes. What is positive change for one character might feed directly into another character's vice. This is the beauty of writing outside of a moral binary. Growth means different things to different people. Alternatively, if you have multiple characters with the same core urge on the same axis, make one vastly unhealthier. That way one character can look at the other and say, oh wow, you're like the worst version of me, basically a sign of what they'll become if they don't change, a figurative devil on their shoulder who could be complemented by an angel who managed to overcome that same pathological urge. Alternatively to the alternative, you can have multiple characters with the same urge at the same level of health, except their urges manifest in completely different ways. So in this example, differentiation would happen down here as opposed to up here. You could have 2 characters who both chase external approval, but one becomes a pro basketball player and the other becomes a career politician. Same core urge, completely different manifestations, and then they realize they're not so different at all and junk, and they make out. What I strive for, though, is to have an interlocking web of characters who represent positive and negative influences for each other while still traveling on growth axes of their own, and oh baby, that's where it gets fun. Character relationships sort of grow out of these webs of similarities and differences, and that includes romantic relationships. Obviously, humans don't always choose their mates by weighing their own psychological deficiencies against those of another person. I mean, I sometimes do, but I'm crazy. But for story purposes, for it to matter, you kind of have to find that deeper framework. Like if you want the connection between 2 characters to be there together because they think the other is attractive, fantastic, go for it. Rats do that, bugs do that. Is that your story? Probably not. So platonic or romantic, the human aspect of the relationship is the aspect that lends itself more to drama. The intuitive animalistic aspect is just there. I'm not denying its existence, I'm simply questioning its utility in the context of a limited psychothematic character web. If, hypothetically, you did want to write a relationship that was all magic bonds and hard eyes, then you would have to use the characters' urges as obstacles. Like maybe they would be truly in love with each other, except she's afraid of insignificance and he's afraid of intimacy. So characters can be drawn to each other because of their urges or in spite of them. Both dynamics work. Just figure out which you're doing. Most importantly, the characters are individuals before they are a couple. If you're not sure whether your understanding of a character goes deep enough, there's one simple word that can give you an answer. It's why.
Why does this farmer want to win the zucchini contest? Okay, I guess it's to impress the rest of the town. And why does this farmer want to impress the rest of the town? Because they feel worthless without external validation. And why do they feel worthless without external validation? Well, it's because when they were a kid... Okay, pause. You see how we just crossed over into backstory? That means we passed through the deepest point of the character, this. Everything after that core belief is just a manifestation of it, everything before is trauma. But this is the core. When it comes to what's in this circle, you shouldn't have to bring up any other characters or any nouns, this is the soul.
If neither the character map or the Y chain work for you, you could use this instead. Same idea, is just a different configuration I changed, by the way. These are the layers of a character. The character's core urge is here, individual, but the way they relate to others, ideas, groups, things outside of themselves, that's here in this next layer. That's relational. So melodrama is when you're just operating in this relational layer, but it never connects to the center. And then if you go one more layer, you cross over into meta. That's where archetypal labels like protagonist and villain come into play. They're descriptive. They're outside looking in. When you assign a character a trait, you need to be extremely conscious of how deep that trait actually is. Arrogance, for example. We want our character to be arrogant. So we imagine arrogance as being here, and we try to depict it in the character's choices and dialogue. And it doesn't land, because the reality is arrogant is a descriptive term that could describe a number of complexes. Is your arrogant character an intellectual who gains a sense of comfort from understanding the world and thus attacks perspectives that don't align with their understanding? Is he a person who feels innate shame and acts cocky to compensate and prove himself? Or does he lash out at others because he's terrified of his control being challenged? Or does he have a savior complex and thinks he knows what's best for everyone? I could keep going, but you see what I mean? Trying to make an external observation like arrogance the core of a character is like trying to replicate a 5-star restaurant's food just by reading their Yelp reviews. Like, Gladys from Maryland said the ravioli was excellent. Write that down. We gotta remember to put excellence in the ravioli. Like, it's not how cooking works. You have to actually get the recipe, and then the consumers apply those labels, not you. We can certainly work backwards from these external observations. So when you say this character is a hero, that's fine, but understand that you're not describing anything about the character. You're making a statement about how you want other people, whether they be readers, meta, or other characters, relational, to describe that character. And then you're gonna have to work backward from that to actually create the fictional person. A character believing in a god or being loyal to a cause isn't deep enough. Those are second-level relational traits. You have to ask why they believe in a god or why they're loyal to that cause. What urge from within compels them to relate to the world around them in these ways? My rule of thumb is try to describe the character without referencing any other characters or any other specific elements in the story. Then you'll know if they stand on their own. I did say I would address other conceptions of character and show how they plug into this thing. And one of the most popular is the want versus need model. Want versus need is kind of an apples versus oranges situation. A want is derived from the character's urge. It's a thing they've set their mind to because it does something for them. It satisfies their urge. Like, I didn't receive love unless I achieved things, so achieving becomes my urge, and therefore I want to get the best grade. It's relational, derived from individual. Need, on the other hand, is a meta-construct. It's what I, the writer, have decided is best for this character according to my own morals. It's a framing device, which is fine. It's impossible to not have some level of meta-framing, but it's in a totally different category than want. In my system, the closest thing to need is the assumption that the character might need to unlearn or de-universalize the urge, assuming the urge is being framed as a flaw, which it almost certainly is to a degree. Need is also a messy word like theme because it does get used in a lot of different ways. A lot of writers define need as basically want but deeper, which I call urge, or deeper still, a survival requirement, which I'm guilty of sometimes, but I do hope the discrepancy is obvious in context. And none of these align with the accepted psychological definition of need, which is simply a deficiency that arouses behavior. So be careful with this word, it's a doozy. So again, think of your character, think of the urge. Now think of a situation where that urge will not work. That's the first step to creating an arc. For example, the super common trope of the tough military dude who has to look out for some little kid. It's literally that. I'm going to give you something that your normal system cannot manage, and it's going to force you to grow or break. The single biggest reason people don't like my system might be the fact that I oppose a character having multiple core urges and multiple arcs surrounding them. People will ask me, why can't my character be driven by a desire for fame, but also he's afraid of being alone, but also he likes to be in control? And my answer is always, well, what if you had to make him choose? Which one would come out on top? That's his foundation. But I realize this could use some qualification. What I'm really opposed to is the character having a random grab bag of motivations, pulling them in different unrelated directions. But there are ways to connect those motivations. Option 1, urge versus the absence of urge. Option 1 is you create contradictory drives on a single axis of health, chasing status and recognition, versus accepting that you're enough and don't need all of that. In my conception of character, these are not two separate motivations. These are two ends of a single range of possibility, corresponding to one urge, with the positive end being the absence of said urge. This works. And if you have a character at a medium level of health, yeah, they could be yanked one way or the other throughout the story. But that's not two urges, that's one urge versus the absence of it. It's like the basis for any sitcom character who is mostly good, but they just have that one little compulsion that gets them into trouble and causes them to butt heads with their friends, and it totally works. Here's what doesn't work. Chasing recognition versus relinquishing power and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. That's just apples and oranges. Those aren't on the same axis. They're two different things, two different arcs, two different conversations. They don't belong in the same character. Again, which one matters more? But option 2 is stacking. That's where instead of trying to have what is essentially multiple characters in the same body, you decide which one is the base layer, and then you find some way to plug the other thing into it. So it's really just a manifestation of the first thing. So instead of saying the character wants recognition and power, which are two different things, you can say they want recognition as a means of achieving power, or power as a means of achieving recognition, but you still define the base layer. So then people will look at me and they'll ask, well, what if one chunk of the story explores one core issue, and then in the sequel or whatever, I explore a different one? And I'm like, so let me get this straight. You want to establish all of this stuff and build an arc around it, beginning, middle, and end, but then in the sequel, you want to swap it out for some other issue? Because to me, this issue is the character, or like 95% of the character. So if you change this, it's not the same character anymore. You're just putting a different soul in the same body. Like, what do you think a character is? Just their vibe and their quirks? That's just the dressing on top of this for me. So the notion that you could just swap this out and tell a different story with the same character is kind of insane to me. I just don't get it. A character is a range of possibilities, but not an infinite range. So the point I'm trying to make with all of these configurations is to emphasize that when you're dealing with multiple internal forces acting on a character, the goal should not be to balance them. The goal should be to connect them with a vertical hierarchy where one thing causes the other. Now, I have seen some people overthink this and turn a character into a complicated equation of inputs and outputs. Like, she wants to be loved, but only partially because she wants to be in control, because control makes her happy, and she sees happiness as love unless she can't be loved because then she'll become self-destructive. No, stop. Keep it simple. If you do it like that, you're not going to be able to designate a specific axis of growth or regression. This storytelling theory business is very wordy, and I think some people get tangled up in the words and lose sight of what they're actually doing. Obviously, characters don't have to have positive arcs. Your character could fail to unlearn their urge. They could fall even deeper into their unhealthy pattern. They could tragically die because they don't overcome it. The beats in that story would look a little different. You'd still have that first act moment where they encounter a situation that doesn't compute with their core urge, but instead of overcoming it, they succumb to it. They fail to learn, and the story punishes them for it. I just like to rip the Band-Aid off and give characters names. I've worked with writers before who were like about to start drafting, or they were already drafting, and they still were using placeholders like the main character and the main character's sister. And I don't know how you can get into it until you name your characters. It doesn't really matter what you name them. It's just a label, but pick something. A name is like a container for the meaning you'll fill it with. The longer you go without naming your characters, the harder it's going to be, because now you have to cram everything into the container at once, and it's going to feel off because the character basically grew up in your mind without a name. And the word that's going to now represent 100% of that character on the page is the textual equivalent of that friend who joined the group later and doesn't know all of the inside jokes. Give your characters names immediately. Just trust me. I think that covers all of the character stuff. Oh yeah, except... So to address another fundamental thing that people get hung up on, a lot of writing advice is built on character archetypes like protagonist, antagonist, deuteragonist, station wagonist. Most of the content of this video comes from my consulting work. I pay attention to the problems I encounter. I pay attention to the types of solutions my clients and I find. I write down patterns, I get second opinions, and then I eventually write a cohesive video script and put my thoughts on the internet. I say all of this because in all of my travels, I can't think of a single instance where the lack of a clear protagonist was the problem. Not once have I ever found myself going, well, this piece is full of colorful characters with deep motivations and dynamic relationships, and the logic of the story is perfectly coherent. It executes setups and payoffs immaculately, but damn it, it doesn't lend itself to my arbitrary meta labels, so I must change it. Oh, but don't you know? The opponent needs to attack the hero's flaws. They need this, they need that. It's like, not really. It's just characters. That's it. Characters are driven by different things. Their differences cause them to come into conflict. Sure, you can dress one up in black, spiky stuff and say, this one is the bad guy, but ultimately the antagonist is not a different kind of entity from any other character. They're just a person. They have a core urge, which manifests in all areas of their life, yada yada, not special. Like, obviously, you can and should create characters who naturally find themselves in conflict, given their opposing drives, and you can certainly make one considerably less healthy and slap an evil coat of paint on them if you so choose, but these archetypal frameworks are not desirable for their own sake. You could have a clear protagonist, a clear antagonist, helpers, mentors, etc., or you could swap out the entire cast halfway through and say the moon was the protagonist all along. It doesn't matter. So, zooming out, everything I just went over constitutes my complete understanding of character. But There is something I have to clarify, which is that I don't think your story is bad for not being this deep. I think people on YouTube are so used to the ultra-combative world of movie good, movie bad value judgments that they think when I'm talking about writing, I'm creating some kind of grading hierarchy, which is not what I'm doing. I am simply creating a way to understand depth. I don't think having a big, deep arc makes your story inherently better, but I am going to teach that because I want to give you that option. If you just want to tell a story about a shallow, static character wrapped up in a cool plot, go ahead. I love stories like that. They're great. But are you not better off for knowing the deeper levels? Even if you just want to chill in the shallow end, is it not better that you know how to swim? What happens when you do want to give your static, shallow character a moment of vulnerability? How will you know what sort of vulnerability is most appropriate for them? So the first 50 minutes of this video consisted of me playing in the character psychology sandbox, and all of that is important, but we are talking about stories, and stories do have form. So let's talk about structure. Specifically, let's talk about act structure. Okay, you know the Frappuccino spiral or whatever? It's that series of numbers where each number is the sum of the previous two numbers, and it shows up all over mathematics and nature and stuff. Like, things just naturally tend to do this. Well, that's how I want you to think about act structures. Act structures are not arbitrary traditions that storytellers follow. They're just extensions of basic logic. Things were one way, and then a disruptive event happened, and now things are a different way. That's an act structure. Odds are your story will have an act structure whether you try to give it one or not. Act structures are not formal guidelines. They were not invented by Sir John Act Structure in 1704. They are just ways to describe the natural flow of story. You become small. So this 3-act structure is just a rhythm that stories fall into. Here are the acts. Typically in a 3-act structure, Act 1 is about establishing normalcy and building tension. Act 2A is about learning and exploring the concept. 2B is about conflict and failure, and Act 3 is about resolution and redemption and growth. To get a bit more specific, the first little chunkier story is status quo. What does that mean? It means the status quo of the world, the state of the society or whatever, but also the emotional status quo. So the way the characters have been thinking and feeling for the last 10, 20, 30 years of their lives before this select chunk of time that you've carved out for the story to happen. Basically, you need to set the emotional history, and there has to be a sense of normalcy, right? A bunch of stuff shouldn't have happened just before this, because then why wasn't that the start? So status quo, very important. You can't skip this because eventually, obviously, your characters, your world, everything is going to change. And to properly sell that change, we need to know what it used to be. We need to know what is changing into what. So then you get the inciting incident. This is whatever your story is about pops up right here. It doesn't really take shape into a plot yet, but we get our first little glimmer of it, and then usually the characters will debate about what to do about it, or they sort of investigate it, or there's a bit of a limbo period here. The break into Act 2, I just think of as the situation beginning. The story is being what it was marketed as. The story commits to being what it is. Whatever that cool premise is, really kicks in Act 2. And then 2A is called Fun and Games, I think, in Save the Cat, just because it is typically the chunk of the story where things are not being taken that seriously, and we're still learning the rules, learning the ropes. Like Neo in The Matrix, he gets there, and then this chunk of the story is guns and kung fu. And then at the midpoint, something happens. A lot of the time, the midpoint is just where the stakes kick in, where the conflict catches up to the characters, and then you often have a big bar of just stuff here, just crisis, which ends in some kind of failure. Morpheus gets kidnapped, and then lessons, regrouping, and then conclusion, new status quo. To use another example, we could do a story like How to Train Your Dragon. The status quo is Hiccup is this loser kid in the dragon village, and things have always been this way, and they're always going to be this way, and then, he shoots down a very rare and dangerous dragon, he tracks it down, and then the thing that's in the title, Training the Dragon, starts in Act 2. He has all this fun with it where he's learning things, then he's applying that knowledge to his dragon school, and he's just kicking ass. And then there's a big midpoint confrontation where Toothless has to come and save him, which ends in Toothless getting captured, and then everybody has to gear up for the big battle at the end. The supporting characters come in and they're riding dragons too. Now, this is not meant to demystify all of storydom, but it is a formula that works. And you can add to it, subtract from it, and subvert it to your heart's content. Don't feel obligated to, though. This is so general. Your story isn't unoriginal for following this structure any more than a painting is unoriginal for being on a canvas. But let's talk about the painting. Your characters are unique fictional entities you've created, and now it is time to plug them into this structure. Once you know what your characters are going to struggle with, you can place their major arc beats on your act structure timeline. You can weave their individual storylines into the big storyline. Don't think of arcs as gradual processes of change that will just stop you from creating hard-hitting pivotal scenes. Think of arcs as consisting of a few key moments. For instance, if I know that a character struggles with a control urge, I can confidently say that right about here is the moment that they should ignore the lesson and hold on to control. And right here are the consequences of that, the dark night of the soul, and then the character is finally going to overcome their need for control and relinquish it in some capacity. And that's going to be the ending of their storyline. I don't know what any of that means in plot terms. I don't know where those scenes are or who else is in them. I don't even know what story I'm talking about right now. I will figure out the context of these moments later. Right now, they are just emotional placeholders. If you're unsure about what your placeholders should be and you didn't get much out of the first 50 minutes of this video, I did an entire series about how the 9 Enneagram types are basically 9 prepackaged character arcs. If you're feeling lost, go see if any of those speak to you. So right now, the goal is not plot. The goal is simply to create a timeline of character moments. The big choices, the revelations, the key emotional scenes, the conversations. When I say timeline, I mean timeline. Some people make digital timelines on apps like Miro, but I like to make a literal timeline on a literal wall. And then I use sticky notes to represent the aforementioned character moments. Now, I know what you're wondering. Is there a song to explain this? As a matter of fact, there is.
You assign each character a different color sticky note. And you find a nice big wall. Divide the wall into imaginary columns. From left to right, each column is a scene. If a character is present in the scene, you put their sticky note in that column. And on that sticky note, you write what they're doing, thinking, or feeling in the scene.
For every scene?
For every scene.
Oh my god.
Until you're done. Sticky note. Oh, don't you see?
I think I do.
For every scene, it's so much fun.
Yes.
That's it. I got a lot of people asking me if I could give a more specific explanation, but there is none. It's a timeline color-coded by character. Very simple. If I put a sticky note not directly on the column, it's probably because I don't know exactly where it goes yet, or it's a sentiment that spans a period of time. If I leave a blank one, it might just be because I know a character is present, but I haven't figured out what they're doing yet. I don't know. Treat this like a flow state visualizer. It's not a rigid system. Rigid systems are never good for creativity. You want broad, flexible heuristics. You can move notes around, you can change them. Nothing is sacred, nothing is permanent. I do it in part because I like to stand and pace around while I work. It's great for a group setting, it's great if you're addicted to color coding everything. But regardless of how you do it, now is the time to lay out all of your story beats where you can see them. Keep in mind, this beat board is not a definitive scene list, not yet. So don't worry about the transitions between scenes. Don't worry about locations. Don't worry about the flow of the story. The focus is on the characters and what they do. Placeholders are the what, plot is the how. Here's the thing about plot. In my experience, it kind of just starts happening. While you're trying to figure out the character arcs, you'll accidentally generate some plot. While you're outlining, you'll accidentally generate some plot. Because plot is an emergent phenomenon. I see it in the same way I see world building. For me, plot just grows out of and supports the real heart of the story, which is the characters and their inner urges and journeys. Plot is not something you create independently of character. If you can make up a plot and then just shove whatever characters you want into it, one of two things is true. Either your plot doesn't need the characters to happen, or your plot is so emotionally unspecific that anyone could do it, both of which I consider suboptimal. Like I said earlier, if you find yourself in this situation, stop. Figure out the story package, the characters, their journeys, the ideas they grapple with, and be prepared to throw elements of your story away. In this system, plot is not an end, it is a means to an end, which is character drama. You have these characters that are fundamentally different, but just because characters are fundamentally different doesn't mean they're automatically going to butt heads. Contrast doesn't automatically mean conflict. So you have to put them in a situation that brings their conflict to the surface. This is perhaps the most important function of plot. It should be custom built to force characters to reckon with their inner problems. So basically, just make up a plot that gets you the character beats you want. Now, just because your plot is serving your characters doesn't mean it should look that way. It still needs to be logically sound so that it resembles a natural domino effect. Not necessarily realistic, just logically sound.
Before I did YouTube full-time, I had a job as an instructional technologist, making educational digital stuff. And for this job, I had to learn how to code in JavaScript. I hated it, but in JavaScript, you have to declare variables. That means you have to tell the computer what things are going to be important in your code. When I was writing practice code, I would tell my computer that the variable asphalt was important. And since I told my computer that asphalt was important and I gave asphalt a specific value, the computer had to acknowledge the importance of asphalt. Asphalt could very well be the defining variable in a mountain of code, and as long as the importance of asphalt was consistent and I didn't contradict myself, the code wouldn't have any errors. Remember, It's a Movie isn't your free pass to treat everything as unimportant, but it is your free pass to decide what's important, to set those variables. Anything can matter in your story as long as you're consistent about how much it matters.
So the steps are figure out your characters and what their internal journeys are going to be, lay their journeys onto a 3-act structure, potentially using sticky notes, and manufacture plot to facilitate their journeys. But obviously, this act structure I've been working off of is for feature films. What about, let's say, an 8-episode limited series? Don't overthink it, just think of the show as one big movie. So, in an 8-episode series, Act 1 would be episodes 1 and 2, Act 2, episodes 3 through 6, and Act 3, episodes 7 and 8. The beats still fall in the same places. They're just a little bit more spaced out. And you can fill that space with more character scenes, more world-building detail, whatever you want. Depending on how much you stretch, you might have entire episodes where nothing happens to the main plot line. But when the main plot line beats do happen, they happen at the correct times. So we can expand those beats, but we can also contract them. What about a short film? It would still be the same 3-act structure, but now those key moments happen in relatively quick succession. Status quo, new thing, complication, resolution. And if you do this, you start to see the accordion everywhere. And this works for any story that has an ending. If you are dead set on writing a story that does not have an ending, nothing I'm saying applies. If you're writing a show that you figure will eventually end, but you're not going to worry about that because you want to wring a good 4 or 5 seasons out of the thing, nothing I'm saying applies. This is only for people who are building their stories all at once. If a story is open-ended, I don't even know if that's a story. I would just call that entertainment. I know that's a very dramatic thing to say, but when you remove the idea of a definitive ending, you can no longer build towards a true resolution. When I'm working with clients, sometimes I'll just get a pilot and maybe a first season outline, but nothing beyond that. And the client will be like, oh, I just want to worry about the first season. But even though I respect that, I still put these clients on the spot and make them give me a number, or at least an estimate. How many seasons, how many episodes per season? Even if those numbers are 100 and 25 respectively, that's still a finite stretch of time, which means we can figure out where the important beats will land. We know what should be happening around episode 700. But if you don't set an endpoint, it all falls apart. How close are we to the end? Nobody knows, which means it's not obvious when big emotional character moments should happen. You're going in completely dark. There's no relativity. There's no way to gauge scale. And if you can do that, hey, respect. But endless stories are not for me. I talk about them a little bit more in my episodic video. Serialized TV is when you have to watch the episodes in order because each one flows into the next, and they have an overarching plot. Episodic TV is when each episode gets to be its own thing, a new contained adventure every time. That's the unspoken contract between episodic creators and episodic consumers. I will watch because I enjoy spending time with these characters. And as long as these characters are being utilized in faithful and dynamic ways, I will keep tuning back in. But for serialized content, the contract is this better be headed towards a meaningful climax. I also want to touch on sequels. I tend to disapprove of completing one installment and then starting from scratch and building another one, just because there's credits or a back cover between the first installment and the second doesn't mean it's not all one continuity. I think people have become conditioned to take sequels for granted because of how popular they are, but a lot of these sequels are not pulling on the deeper threads of the original if the originals had any to begin with. Ripley in Aliens functionally is not the same character as Warrant Officer Ripley in the original. Alien 1 was a survival story. Ripley was a space girl with a no-nonsense personality. Not super deep, but hey, awesome. And then Ripley in the second one has this whole motherhood journey. Also awesome. Cameron used the available material and gave it a dramatic backbone. And he wasn't inhibited by any deep stuff that came before because there wasn't any. For this reason, I would wager that the ease of writing a deep sequel is inversely proportional to how deep the original was. In other words, if you blew your emotional load in the first one and you gave all of the characters their arcs, what's next? Like I talked about earlier, Tony Stark has his arc in the first Iron Man movie, his why changes, and then everything after that is just development bolstered by melodrama and plot. His what and how change, but the true psychological shift occurred in the first one. If you're dead set on having a complete arc in your first installment, that's cool, but know that sequels are going to be a pain in your ass. You have some options available to you. You could go the superhero route and keep them dramatically static while finding other levers of intrigue and excitement. Valid. You could have the character revert back to their old ways. You could go with the Blade Runner approach, swap out protagonists, put your old MC in a supporting role now that they've learned their lesson. You could go with the True Detective anthology approach and just bring in a whole new cast. But typically, when people come to me talking about sagas and they say, oh, I'm only worrying about the first book, I just make them lay out the whole thing in front of me and I treat it like one story because it is. And I ignore the borders between installments and I put the sticky notes where they need to go. And people usually thank me later. So I spent a bunch of time talking about characters, how to build and arrange and manage them. Then I talked about attaching characters to structure. And then I talked about how structure expands and contracts across mediums. And I kind of framed all of this as a procedural paint-by-numbers thing. But stories are not created on an assembly line. They develop organically. Every finished story is the result of potentially a years-long tinkering process. And the nature of that process is not immediately evident to the consumer, specifically the starting point or the initial spark of inspiration. So I want to share some alternative backdoors into story. I want to explore other tributaries, other starting points, because I don't want this to just be treated as a one-size-fits-all tool. For instance, let's say you are starting with a cool world or concept that you want to turn into a story. Well, you might have to take an alternate path to get to this point. In your case, you're going to have to find the character in the concept. What big moral hang-up does that concept or world have baked into it? The example I use is the sci-fi cloning premise. What would people in that cloning story fight about? Human rights, the essence of self? So then each side of that argument becomes a character. And then, this is important, you work backwards, you figure out what urges might compel them to take that side of the argument. Again, ideology is not enough. And voila, you have a cast. I've noticed a lot of world-first writers are very hesitant to decide which story in their world they want to tell. Don't get locked into a false dichotomy here. You can tell as many stories as you want. Just pick one to start with. Another common starting point is the OC. Generally, this is a character that sort of just lives in your head or in artwork, and you never plan to feature them in a story. In the least patronizing way possible, think of it kind of like an imaginary friend. But then, one day, you're like, what if I did write a story about my little person? And so you sit down and you try to do it, but oftentimes there are issues. I think the single biggest clog in the artist to writer pipeline is the lack of real depth in their OCs. They know this stuff, but they don't know this stuff. And they've gotten away with not knowing this stuff because this stuff is enough to make you feel like you know the character. They walk like a person, talk like a person, vibe like a person, so they must be a person. It's your sense of empathy doing its job and filling in those gaps. Especially if the character is bolstered by an expressive visual design, their soul is kind of just implied. But when it comes time to put the character on a character-specific journey, the implied soul doesn't cut it. That feeling of knowing the character doesn't translate to automatically being able to place them in a dramatic framework. So you have to actually figure this stuff out, which can unfortunately expose contradictions in your existing conception of the character. You need to backtrack and figure out what this character's core urge is, understand what their emotional journey is going to be. If the character has been sort of a timeless entity thus far, and you do plan for them to have an arc, another important question is, where on the timeline is my existing conception of this character? Have I been imagining their pre-arc self, their post-arc self, their mid-arc self? You have to figure that out if you want to build a story around them. If you want to give your character an arc, you have to figure out if the version of that character you have now is post-arc, pre-arc, or mid-arc. You have to place this character on a timeline, and no matter where you place them, you're going to be forced to spend whole scenes, maybe even whole acts, with a version of this character that you're unfamiliar with, because that's how arcs work. Ultimately though, no matter where you're starting, you need to isolate the character or characters, figure out their core issues, and determine if and how they're going to change. This combo is the jumping off point for everything else. Character, urge, arc, if applicable. If you don't get that right, you're going to be months deep into a super complicated plot, but the characters are going to be nonsense. Get the package figured out. Of course, the final hypothetical here is that you already wrote a draft, or 6. You've probably picked up on the fact that I plan everything. However, plenty of writers prefer to just fly by the seat of their pants and start typing. I previously thought of this as a spectrum from planner to pantser, but someone pointed out to me that actually, everybody pantses on some level. I structure as far into the process as I can, but my understanding of dialogue and word choice is an intuitive artsy thing. Some writers stop structuring at the scene level, some writers stop structuring at the act level, some writers get 1 or 2 plot beats and decide they're ready to go, some even less. So it's really just a matter of how thoroughly you prefer to plan your stories. That being said, if you're not sure, I am going to yell at you and tell you to do it my way. Reason being, in theory, you don't want to write a draft if you're going to be baking flaws into it. At least that's the way I think about it. But this happens like all the time. It happens to me even though I actively try to avoid it and I put off the drafting process. And sometimes you just got to nuke the thing from orbit and start over. You got to resist the urge to refer back to this. It was premature. It never should have existed. It was a phenotypic extrapolation of some jank-ass inbred story DNA. You need to correct those genes before you grow another body, or the same thing is just going to keep happening over and over again. It's not your writing that's broken, it's the story. But a decent chunk of you have drafts that you've put a lot of work into. I mean, you're online looking for writing advice. There's a good chance you have something written and don't like it. And I do apologize, I had to set the table, but let me address this demographic. If you already have a broken draft, here are the 4 steps you need to take in order to save it. Listen very carefully. Step 1, reverse engineer your draft into an outline. When trying to fix a broken script, it is a massive waste of energy to have to scroll down the document and fix one scene, but oh no, now you need to fix the counterpart scene, and now you have to find somewhere else to put that information, but in doing so, you forgot about that other scene, so now you have a duplicate. I'm telling you, just spare yourself the hassle. Translate your script into an easily accessible timeline, potentially using sticky notes. Step 2, break up with your draft. Tell your draft, it's been fun, but you two are clearly in different stages of life, and yeah, you didn't bowl a perfect game either, but in the end, you were willing to put in the work and she wasn't. And you're not gonna let her string you along. Because what is love without self-respect, you know? Banish your draft to the shadow realm. It's not relevant anymore. Just forget it ever existed. Step 3, look long and hard at your outline. Go through each character's journey in order of importance and make the necessary adjustments. It's okay to use emotional placeholders. If you realize you're lacking a moment where your protagonist gives up at the end of Act 2, just pencil that in. Plot comes later. Step 4, break no contact with your draft. Invite it out for a drink. Be clear about your intentions. You're not attached, you've moved on, but hey, maybe it still has some scenes that can be repurposed. Take what you need and then leave for good. How do we take what we have and turn it into a story? How do we connect the dots? This part of the process is hard to talk about because it mostly depends on the context of your project. I can't tell you exactly what your story needs if I don't read it, but I can help you set the stage for maximum progress. The first thing you need to do is define your goals. Here are some examples of what a goal would be. Outline a 90-minute feature film. Clarify the arc of the main character. Create a climax that incorporates the supporting characters. Fix a plot hole. Now let's talk about what isn't a goal. Make it better. Write a good story. Those are not real goals. Better and good are blanket value judgments. What you define as good is not what somebody else necessarily defines as good. You need to be more specific in the standards you set for yourself, or you will just be floundering around. You need to identify problems that are problems to you. If you're still not sure, guess what? You don't have to do this alone. There's this myth of the lone wolf writer slaving away for years on their masterpiece, and I've worked with people who fully embody it. And most of the time, I'm not even kidding, they make more progress with me in an hour than they have in the last 5 years. And while I am decently good at this, I don't think it's that they're talking to me. I think it's that they're talking to someone. Bring your ideas to another writer. Don't wait 5 years. Do it now while the thing is still fresh in your mind. People ask me about writer's block and how to get out of it. Like, yeah, it's literally so easy. Talk to another writer. Collaborate. It's never not worked for me. This is not a recommendation. It is a prescription. Once you have those initial creative roots in place and you know what you're missing and you know what your goals are, that is the best time to seek help. Strike while the iron is hot. Not after it's cooled, not before you have iron to strike. Do it right now, when you know just enough to direct the conversation. But, this is important, your partner should know nothing. You should have them go in blind. At the beginning of the conversation, you pitch it to them or you have them read something in advance, and then you just pop on a call and go. This other person should not care about your project in the way that you do. If you're writing in a 2-person team and you're both stale, same principle. Get a new voice, get an outsider. And then just let them talk. So if you'll forgive my constant recapping, first I spent a bunch of time going over characters and what happens in their brains. Next I talked about applying all of that character stuff to a narrative structure. And then I talked about the different ways to approach this process. And now I want to get into the weeds and cover some specific topics that I could not cram in anywhere else. First one's a quickie: pacing. Bad pacing is not a problem. It is a symptom of a problem. If someone is critiquing your work and they tell you that they don't like the pacing, you should pay attention to that. That person is using their limited tools to say, hey, I think this thing has a problem. But then it's your job to figure out what the problem is. Don't just be like, oh yeah, copy, pacing, thank you so much. You go through every scene in the target area and you realize that your final confrontation contains scenes that only exist to reiterate information. You also spot a leftover scene from an earlier draft that no longer serves the function you originally intended it to, which is basically a filler scene, and you find an entire exchange of dialogue in which nothing meaningful is being communicated. And that amalgamation of things translates into what feels like a sluggish third act. And the other thing that I believe contributes to the illusion of fast pacing is a lack of falling action. You really, really, really need time to check in with all of your characters, all of your plot lines, all of your dynamics, after the thing has concluded, to say, hey, how you doing now? How you doing now? After all that shit, how are you feeling right now? What'd you learn from this, you know? That's a big one. So you fix the problems, and suddenly people stop telling you that you have bad pacing. Fancy that. It's almost like pacing is an audience word and not a writer word. Is the term pacing still helpful sometimes? Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we're just talking about how something feels to an audience, you know, if we're communicating with that audience, if we're trying to get into the audience's head, then it can be a useful stepping stone. But it is not a quality in and of itself. And even like a year after making that video, I still feel that way about pacing. Okay, next I want to talk about world building.
World building versus lore, what's the difference? Well, language is a limited tool we use to make sense of reality, but as far as this video is concerned, I'm going to call world building the horizontal scope of the fictional universe. Like, if I dropped you into a story and you looked around, what would you see? Places, cultures, institutions, languages, etc. And I'm going to say that lore is the story of how it all got there. These two things work together, but they're not the same.
So yeah, world building is the horizontal axis, width, breadth, and lore is depth. Lore is how'd that get here? pretty self-explanatory.
If you just show me a single image of the ball in the air, I don't know how long it's going to be in the air. I don't know where it's going to land. I don't know its story. But if you show me where the ball is and where it was 5 seconds ago and where it was 5 seconds before that, I can very easily predict where it's headed. And that, I think, is where a world builder might run into some problems, because no matter how intricate and beautiful their fictional world is, it's still fundamentally one picture of a ball. But in addition to informing your story proper, wide chaining can also uncover contained stories in the past. George R.R.R. Martin knew Daenerys had to come from an ancient dragon-riding family, but he knew that there couldn't still be dragons in the family by the time she came along, because the whole reason she's special is because she hatches some dragons. So he had to ask why Daenerys hatching dragons was special, why none existed prior. And the most plausible and also the coolest answer was the Targaryens got all of their dragons killed in a civil war. Why was there a civil war? And just like that, a whole new story begins to branch out with its own complex cast of characters embodying different perspectives, plotting, scheming, backstabbing, not having finished scripts because of the writer's strike, not being able to improvise because it's in their contracts, please halt production. And that's how lore is done.
Finally, before I wrap this video up, I want to touch on dialogue.
You're probably not going to find yourself in a perfect situation to disclose everything your audience needs to know. More than likely, you'll be forced to do it within the confines of a dialogue scene. And by confines, I mean the nature of your characters. You have this giant pile of information, but your character acts as a filter. So the information is, Bob feels extremely sad, but the filter is, Bob is really committed to being an optimist. So Bob can't just come out there and openly be sad. To communicate to the audience that he's sad, we have to sneak through the filter. Bob would only say optimistic things because he's Bob, but we can have Bob phrase them in a vaguely cynical way. We can have him do subconscious things that give away his true emotions. That's basically the mental model I use to approach dialogue. Information through a human filter. The filter is, in a sentence, how would this character in this situation communicate this information? So yes and is one of the core tenets of improv. Basically it means you should never just respond. You should respond and then give your scene partner a little extra. That way the conversation can mutate, new information keeps getting added by design, the scene stays alive and never gets stale. Does that mean you should drop a huge game-changing revelation at the end of every line? Absolutely not. All I'm saying is that maybe the answer to your writer's block is letting a bit of additional information slip out. This is what we'll call a type A conversation. Every line is a line, every color is an idea. But this is a type B conversation. The colors are offset. Here's the yes, here's the and the and sets the stage for the next line, making the conversation harder to disengage from.
First model walks, second model duplicates, then elaborates.
Character voice is a thing that a lot of writers worry about. Nobody wants their characters to all talk the same, right? The most common solutions for the character voice problem are typically just suggestions on how to differentiate. Like all of those writing Instagram pages that look like this, it's always just longer versus shorter sentences. Do they use contractions? Give them one weird quirk or mannerism so that they stick out. But I think this is a very surface level approach to the problem. So I just wanted to go over my model for dialogue. The first step for building dialogue is context. What's the situation? What's happening in the plot? What was just revealed? What was just said? Then it's how does the character feel about that context? And then you take how they feel and you filter it. What are you filtering it through? Well, for one, goals. The raw thoughts in your head don't always serve your goals. Like if you had a crush on your coworker, you wouldn't be able to freely express yourself because of that filter, the career. So I want to spend the rest of my life with you might get transformed into, I'll print anything for you, just let me know. Because you have a vested interest in keeping your job. And then there's the superego. That's the voice in your head that makes you feel guilty for things, I think. Most people think it comes from culture and upbringing. That's going to dilute the original feelings too. Also ask yourself, would the character speak at all? If the feelings are inappropriate and the character knows they're inappropriate, they might keep it in or only espouse a partial truth. Depends on the character. Obviously, these filters exist. See what I mean? I think character voice is such an elusive thing for people because they're trying to create all of that differentiation at the surface level, at the word level, instead of thinking about what's actually driving the characters. And I get that there's more pressure when you're working with prose as opposed to screenplays, but either way, I'm much more forgiving of similar speech patterns than I am of dialogue that doesn't reflect actual frickin' consciousness. What would this specific character say in this situation? Looking back on their journey thus far, the lessons they've learned, the other forces weighing on them, their current emotional state, how would they react mentally and emotionally? Would they actually ask the question you're having them ask? Or do they already know the answer? Or would they not care? Or would they phrase the question in a way that reflects their biases? You need to go through your dialogue with a fine-tooth comb and make sure it's character specific. Sure, maybe on a stylistic level, but more importantly on a thought level. Words come from brains. That's like the fun part for me. I'm not saying I completely disregard rhythm and flavor in dialogue, but knowing dialogue is only the tip of the mental iceberg has made the process even more rewarding. Now, after all of that, what I'm about to say is probably the last thing you'd expect, but art is subjectular and there are no rules. It's true. There's no such thing as an objectively good story. Yes, there is a such thing as an objectively consistent story, but you can't make the leap from consistent to good, because good is a value judgment. Why is consistency good? Because people tend to like consistent stories? Okay, well, now you're appealing to popularity. Also cringe. When I realized this, it was a hard pill to swallow because I had built my entire artistic identity on the notion of an objective standard of goodness. But when I finally let it go, I realized that I didn't need it. This is the essence of being secure in your creativity, I think. Whether it's an objective grading scale, or a cheering crowd, or your bank account, you shouldn't be looking to something outside of yourself to determine the worth of your art. But it takes a while to get there. A lot of younger writers will tell me they take notes on my videos and follow my formulas, and they'll come to me with questions like, is it okay if I have 2 protagonists? And what I want to tell these people is, stop blindly following my directions. I don't want people to impose arbitrary boundaries on themselves because of what I say. Take my rule about story logic versus real logic. I can talk all I want about how the fates of characters should hinge on their choices and not random coincidence because of cause and effect payoffs, but that's not inherently better. You can make a story where random chance is a deciding factor. The only thing I'll say is, if you're doing that story, do that story. Build your characters and your plot around random chaos and explore how people deal with it. Be deliberate. I'm not going to come after your story for vapid dialogue if vapid dialogue is the point. All I'm saying is, commit to the bit. Ask yourself, do you have a clear vision, or are you juggling a bunch of contradictory elements that you can't bring yourself to abandon or modify? Does this plot thread matter or not? Am I doing X, Y, and Z because it's part of my vision, or because I'm too attached, too comfortable, or otherwise unwilling to advocate for my art? At the beginning of this video, I talked about how trying to create a system for writing is an incredibly frustrating process. But why create systems at all? Like, I've worked on some really inspired projects, and as soon as you have an idea that makes everybody go, oh shit, write that down, like everybody just forgets about the structure stuff. All the writing rules go out the window because now you're excited and you're on a roll and you're doing something truly great. Yet here I am giving hard and fast rules saying this goes here and that goes there. So why does anything I'm saying matter? Why create systems? Why learn rules? What role do systems play in creativity? My personal answer to that is automation. By memorizing systems, you are automating your brain to perform certain tasks, like knowing where certain story beats will hit. Now that you don't have to think about that, you have a bunch of free space in your brain to think about the rhythm or humor of a particular scene, the mannerisms of a character, the subtleties of dialogue, and most importantly, spontaneity, random creative thought. What if this? What if that? Oh my God, that's so funny. We should use that. You can't automate spontaneity. You just have to make room for it by automating the boring tasks and freeing up space. If you use logic to figure out where a scene should sit on the timeline and what it should accomplish, then you can use creative intuition to give that scene texture and poetry. But you can't use creative intuition to give the scene texture and poetry and also figure out where the scene is and what it's about and how it serves the story. There are too many variables. No guardrails. The flowers will not grow until you build the garden. So all of this stuff, at the end of the day, is about creating pathways for your genuine creative intuition to flow through. So how do you know when that is happening? Typically, it's wit, spontaneous humor. Even in the most dead serious of stories, there still needs to be that musicality and that energy in your scenes. Your scenes have to be engaging. And there's no formula for that because it's so situational. Like knowing the exact clever insight to hit the audience with at the exact right time, or the perfect out-of-nowhere gag, or nuance or flourish. There are no shortcuts for wit. But if that spontaneous creative power feels out of reach for you, it's not. You've already experienced it. Every time you've ever thought of the right thing to say in a social setting, or the funniest callback just popped into your head and you got to laugh at someone, you didn't think about it, you just said something clever. And even if those moments are rare to you, as they once were very much so for me, you do have them. You've had them before. We've all had them. And that's creativity. You are creative, and you just need to build up that part of yourself. It is hard at first. The first things you write will probably be very derivative. I remember the first thing I wrote. I've probably told this story before. It was an Adventure Time fan fiction. I didn't even think it was a fan fiction at the time. I thought that I, as like a 10 or 11-year-old, was going to bring it to Cartoon Network and they were going to make it. I don't even know if I like really even scripted it, but I did storyboards on note cards and I believed in it. It was the upper limit of what I was capable of creatively at the time. Now, would I take my favorite show and write an episode with 300% more sword fighting and a self-insert who is super cool and gets everything he wants? No, I've moved on. But I know that this fanfic or wish fulfillment story with zero self-awareness is kind of a rite of passage for a lot of us. Nobody comes right out of the gate with a wholly original story. At best, it's a mashup of all of your favorite elements from your favorite stories. I mean, after I put down the Adventure Time thing, I started trying to write a sci-fi novel. And looking back on it, I was just taking all of the elements I really liked from Star Wars and mashing them together with this documentary called Evacuate Earth, which I was obsessed with at the time. But when I was writing it, it didn't feel derivative. It felt like I was bringing something new into the world, because I was. It was crude, but it was practice. When I talk with less experienced writers, I'll clock that their work is very derivative sometimes. I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that's from and I know what that's from. But I won't hold that against them because that's an essential step in the journey of becoming creative. It has nothing to do with age either. Your first story, whether you're 14 or 40, is going to be a partially blended smoothie with full chunks of the original inspiration still floating around in there. And those chunks play off of each other, but they're not connecting up to a unified creative vision because the writer has not built those brain pathways yet. But it's up there. You have that power. You just need to access it. And we are all on this road together. So that concludes the video. I hope you got something valuable out of this, but if not, there is a lot more coming. Until then, be well and happy writing.